Welcome to the Have Good Ripple Effect podcast. Let's jump right in. Hello and welcome back to the Have Good Ripple Effect podcast. I am Lisa Even, your host. On today's episode, we are talking all about the phrase staying in your lane. Staying in your lane. And I have realized that I'm very passionate about this topic and didn't know so until a trip to the Omaha Zoo. So we're going to talk about what it means to stay in your lane and whether or not it's a good thing. And I hope by the end of today's episode, you are maybe reconsidering or at least considering some of the things that staying in your lane does for you, but also some of the things that it causes. Now, I went to the Omaha Zoo with a friend and her daughter, and I took my two kids. Our husbands were doing fantasy football weekend. Good for them. And we laughed because it was being hosted at my house. And I thought, okay, so we are getting quote unquote kicked out. And we had already seen the grandparents recently. I thought, okay, we don't live too far from Omaha. It's a couple of hours. I'm going to take them overnight and we'll stay in an Airbnb and we'll go to the zoo. And my other friend, one of the other fantasy football moms, was like, oh, Grace and I would love to tag along. And so I was like, let's go. Now, she and I both love leadership. She's in education. I was in healthcare before starting my own company. And we were just debating. And it was funny because we started the conversation on the way there. And then throughout the weekend, we were like chewing on it a little bit more. And even on the way back, we were kind of like, gosh, what do we think? So we debated this from every angle. But she said something to the effect of, sometimes I just want people to stay in their own lane. And I looked at her for a moment and I said, okay, I get that, but I wonder if staying in your lane is actually a little bit dangerous. Now, maybe it was because I was driving and I was thinking to myself, gosh, if I stayed only in my lane, how that could actually cause problems, right? If I stay in my own lane and I get caught behind someone, man, I'm like, gosh, we're never going to get there. I'm probably going to tail them a little bit. And we'll probably see some road rage. But also, like, if I only stay in my own lane, I don't actually create efficiency or, other things that would get me into other spaces. And we were talking about it. It kind of broadened into this idea of staying in your own lane as it relates to work. And I said, I'm just not sure that staying in your own lane will foster collaboration or curiosity. Like, does it foster empathy or innovation? And she and I were kind of talking about that back and forth. And we got to a point where we both agreed that staying in your own lane at work is slightly dangerous. And what we meant by that was when you stay in your own lane and you think about only what you are doing, you kind of miss the things that are like going on in other places and spaces. And then you also don't have any crossover in terms of, well, I've always done it this way, so I'm going to keep doing it this way. But does that actually equal a better result? And I want you to think about, or I invite you to think about like your world of, do you agree with the statement? Because I think it is kind of an interesting perspective of oftentimes we're like, why are you trying to do somebody else's job? Or why are you, focused on this other thing? You should be focused on your thing. But also the benefits that, getting over into somebody else's lane of like, hey, let me see what it's like over here. Or, I need to actually get in that lane so I can turn the other way. Like the ability to pivot directions really is valuable. And our conversation drifted somewhat into, well, how do you invite someone to drive like effectively in their lane, but also keeping an eye on what's going on around them so that they aren't creating silos and ways of thinking that are truly only beneficial to maybe like them or their, pocket of the organization. And I was thinking through what are the phrases or things that I might say out loud to another person to understand their perspective. What's it like to be in their lane? Whether it's a project or a process of like, hey, tell me about how this works, what works really well, but then also asking a follow-up question to how does this affect other groups? Like, what does it cause? And I think that for so long, we've had folks that are like, I don't want to mess up, or I've been told like that's not my job, that sometimes it can cause what I call lack of like critical thinking or lack of like confidence to throw out ideas. I remember one of the first times in one of my locations that I managed, it was like the third time I was there and the printer was not working. And it, back then, it was a few years ago, we printed everything. And I was kind of watching it. I was there for a couple of hours. I'm watching this printer and, you know, the person comes up to grab a copy and someone says like, hey, oh, the printer's not working. And then they walk away. And the person like sitting near the printer, I bet they said it like half a dozen times to people. And so I went over to that person. I was like, hey, how's it going? And they're like, oh, good. The printer's broken. And I was like, yeah. Did anyone call IT? Like, has anyone made the call? And she goes, oh, I don't know. That's not my job. And she kind of knew when she looked at me. She's like, she said it a little hesitantly after that of like, well, like it's not my job, but, and she kind of like stumbled over her words. And I said to her, I was like, so you don't think anybody's called IT? She's like, no, I don't think so. And I was like, why not? She goes, I don't know. And so I called IT. I was like, hey, can you come over and take a look at this printer? And then I hung a sign. It was orange. I hung a sign over the printer that said like, hey, if printer broken, call this number to IT. And it was a few weeks later and I was back and I noticed the printer is broken again. And I think to myself, surely someone has called IT about the printer. And I go over, I'm like, hey, printer's broken again. She's like, gosh, I hate this thing. And she was trying to like fiddle with it a little bit. And she's like, yeah. And I go, did anybody call IT? And she goes, I don't know. And I was like, yeah. So I called IT again. And then a little while later, I came back up to the front desk and I was like, okay, this is really bugging me. Why doesn't anybody call? And she kind of was like, do you want to know the truth? And I was like, yeah. She goes, well, the last manager in this clinic, she told people like, stay in your lane or like, that's not your job. Like she kind of slapped people on the wrist. And so, sometimes people are like, I don't know if I'm like supposed to do that. And I was like, A, thank you for sharing that. And B, in my mind, I'm like, oh, we got to change this. Like I want people to actively take like the initiative to go and like, oh, it's broken. Let me work on that. Like, or it's this and let me work on that. And so it took us a couple of months for the almost like the narrative to shift of like people calling IT because they noticed the printer was broken and they realized like, hey, I can do something about that. And A, that they could do it, and B, that I'm not going to, get mad at them for going and working on something that's not exactly written out in their job description. And I think about kind of circling back to that stay in your lane phrasing. I think that sometimes as leaders, though we're attempting to be helpful by telling people like focus on your work, I think there's also an and of like focus on your work, do it well, and also be considering like what else can you contribute? What other ideas do you have? How does this affect other people? Some of those like curiosity and collaboration and empathy things. And how does that play out? Like, how do we effectively do it? And in another episode, I'll share some tips and tricks on like how to get people to collaborate so that you're not just sitting there with like locked, like disagreement. But I truly do think that the phrase stay in your lane is a dangerous one. We will be so inefficient and not effective and probably stuck behind slow drivers the entire time. Now, I'd love to hear what you think on this topic. I'm on social, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Be sure to reach out, send me a comment. I'm always looking to hear folks that are kind of like, I don't know, Lisa, I disagree. Or just even like how it's showing up in your day-to-day lives. How are you staying in your lane, but also affecting change? Now, thank you for listening to today's episode. Please like, subscribe, follow. And if someone needs to hear this, maybe they're a little too much in their lane, feel free to share it and have a good laugh. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Have Good Ripple Effect podcast. To book me for your next event or get more content like this, visit lisaeven.com. Thanks for listening. Visit lisaeven.com to learn about events and grab a copy of my book, Joy is My Job.